So to start off with, I'm going to sort of introduce effective altruism, some of the key concepts, and then I'm going to use farmed animal advocacy to apply some of those concepts in action. And then I'm going to finish up by talking about some of the insights we've gained from the charity evaluation work that we do at Animal Charity Evaluators, and how that can be applied to organizations. So firstly, what is effective altruism? When people set out to do good in the world, often they have a cause area already in mind. I know this was certainly the case when I learned about the horrors of factory farming, and this kind of became my sole focus in terms of any activism I was doing or anything, and I never really thought about the possibility of doing any work for other cause areas or anything like that. Effective altruism is a movement that kind of does things differently. Rather than starting with a particular cause area, it asks the question, how can we do the most good? And I want to emphasize before moving on, this is the focus is on the most good we can do rather than any good. It's how we can maximize our potential in the world. So from a utilitarian perspective, there are sort of two ways we can do good in the world. We can either increase happiness or decrease suffering. Now, it happens to be the case that there is, unfortunately, a lot more suffering, it seems, than happiness in the world. So a lot of the movement is focused towards how we can do the most to reduce suffering. And it's kind of founded on the scientific method as much as possible. So we use the evidence that we have available to inform our decisions, whether that's like anecdotal evidence all the way through to things like randomized controlled trials, and the gold standard being like meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. Unfortunately, it's often the case that we just do not have enough evidence, this is especially true for animal advocacy, to guide our actions. So we try and use reason and sort of rationality as much as possible to make informed decisions and fill in the gaps for where we don't have evidence to act. And then ultimately, when it comes down to putting this into action, we essentially all have two resources available to give, and that's time and money. Over the course of our careers, we work on average about 80,000 hours, and if we can spend that time working for the most effective cause areas possible, then we can make a huge impact over that time. And the same is true for money. We are, from a global perspective, in a very privileged position, most of us being in the West, in terms of the earnings we have, and a lot of people in the movement pledge 10% of their income to the most effective charities. So this is all very well and good, but how do we go about identifying cause areas to focus on and make progress? So the movement kind of uses this framework of scale, neglectedness, and tractability to make decisions. Firstly, scale. How large will the impact be? How many beings are affected by the potential cause area that you want to focus on, and how much can their suffering plausibly be reduced? And then we have neglectedness. So how many others are working in this field? If you've got two cause areas that are kind of even scale, but there's a ton of people working on one and not many people working on the other, then it's much better to focus on the one where there are not a lot of resources. So that goes for the amount of money on that cause area and the amount of time being invested into solving that problem. And then finally, tractability. So how easy do we think it is to be able to make progress? It could be the case that we have a cause area that we don't think we can make much progress on at the moment, but maybe in 10 or 20 years, due to technological advances, we think we can make a big difference. So then it may be better to not focus on that and focus on something more pressing, or something that has an easier path to progression. So using this framework, the movement has kind of identified three areas at the core of its focus. There are a lot more cause areas within EA, but these are by far the biggest three. So we have global poverty, factory farming, and far future considerations. The first two are fairly intuitive. Far future one maybe isn't, so I'll just spend a moment explaining that. The basic idea is that if we give moral weight to all the beings that are alive today, then we should also be giving moral weight to the future generations of beings that will come into existence in the future. So any actions that we can make today that will maximize the chances of future generations suffering less and being happier, then we should make those actions. So in practice, the far future part of the movement is concerned a lot with things that pose existential risk, so things that risk wiping out humanity. So that's things like AI safety, the classic example of like nuclear warfare, and biotechnology risk is becoming increasingly part of the movement as well. So I just want to, before moving on, say something about factory farming here. The fact that EA as a cause has kind of identified factory farming as being one of the most important areas to be working on, like out of all areas. I found when I first learned about EA, coming from my interest in animal advocacy, I found that really motivating and reassuring that I was working in an area that not only is making a change for animals, but might be the best thing to be doing entirely. So to kind of put this scale, neglectedness, and tractability framework in action, I'm going to talk through how it applies to farmed animal advocacy and how the movement kind of came to the decision that farmed animals were a key area to focus on. So you can see here the different, well, first we have scale. So you can see here some of the different animal groups. The first, so we have animals that are being tested on, companion animals, farmed animals, and then wild vertebrates at the end. For the sake of this discussion, I'm going to sort of leave out wild animals for now. Wild animal suffering is a cause area within EA, but it's quite a small one. But I'm kind of I'm happy to take questions and talk about that at the end. But for the purpose of this, I will leave that out. So if we just consider animals that are used by humans, then 99% of those are for food. So this makes up an overwhelming amount. And we would expect, therefore, that in an ideal world, any resources that are going towards reducing human-caused animal suffering would have the same split. If we look at, this is figures for money going to causes in the US, then environment and animals makes up 3%. And of that 3% that's going towards animals, 99% is going to animals that are used not for food. So there's a huge difference here between, firstly, the scale and then neglectedness. So it kind of ticks those two boxes. And then we come to tractability. So this is kind of a harder question to answer, but we know obviously there are so many of us here today and out in the movement that are working for charities that are making a difference in factory farming. So it seems like it is tractable. To kind of break this down and analyze it, we use theory of change diagrams. So this is a theory of change diagram, and I'm just going to kind of run through it and break it down. So first we have like our charity here, and that charity is then conducting a load of interventions to make change for animals. And in order to make that change, we think there are like 5 main avenues for change. So these first 3 on the right here are creating direct change. So the first one is influencing public opinion. So this is doing individual outreach actions like leafleting, like virtual reality outreach, online ads, books, documentaries, etc. And then we have influencing industry. So these are things like corporate campaigns, institutional outreach, getting institutions to adopt things like Meatless Mondays. And then we have, and then also in the cultured meat space as well, working to bring cultured meat to market to help displace the demand for animal products. And then we have influencing policy and law. So obviously this is trying to enact legal change to enshrine legal protections for animals. But there are also 2 kind of avenues of change that don't directly create change, but they sort of feed into these others, and that's capacity building. So capacity building is essentially building up the capacity of the movement. But what that means is increasing the number of activists, but not only the number, the skill set that those activists have. and also the amount of sort of research and understanding that we have in the movement as well. And then building alliances is essentially building bridges between organizations, and working to create change, as well as building relationships with corporations and with politicians to make things like corporate campaigns more effective and to happen more easily. And obviously this leads then to change for animals. So this brings us to kind of animal charity evaluators. We were set up as part of the Effective Altruism movement to kind of investigate the animal advocacy space and find the best actions to be taking within that space, find the most effective charities, and kind of do research to support the movement and basically help everyone make progress. So to do that, we kind of have 3 areas of research. Firstly is foundational research. So we conduct sort of more fundamental, we try and answer more fundamental questions that may help the movement. So for example, at the moment we've got a project looking into farmed fish welfare, and trying to understand the markers and indicators in fish farming that fish give off when they're stressed, and what factors within fish farming can be manipulated or changed or improved in order to reduce the amount of suffering that goes on in factory farming situations. We expect with the work that's gone into cage-free and broiler hens that fish may well be the next, and we're seeing groups like the Albert Schweitzer Foundation who have started work on that and securing commitments to improve fish welfare. Then we have intervention research. So this is research specifically into the interventions that charities are carrying out. So for example, we'll produce like big reports into things like leafleting and protesting, and use case studies, review all the literature that's available from both the animal advocacy movement and other movements to try and understand how impact has been made there. And then we do some kind of cost effectiveness estimates. We conduct our own meta-analyses if there are enough sort of randomized controlled trials available to inform our understanding. So I think, so from here I want to kind of go through kind of some of the key things we learned from evaluating charities, some of the trends that we see in some of the top charities we recommend. In case you're not familiar with our work or the charities that we do recommend, at least in Europe, L214, Open Cages, Animal Equality, and ProVeg, 3 of the charities we recommend, with Animal Quality being one of our top charities. To give some context. So earlier this year, we looked into how money is being spent in the movement, and this is figures for the US, but we expect, given sort of the history of the movement, that it would be roughly similar in most places. So you can see, coming back to the avenues of change that I was talking about earlier, that influencing public opinion makes up nearly half of all money being spent on farmed animal advocacy. We think influencing public opinion has obviously been really valuable for growing the movement, but with the promise of influencing industry and the successes we've seen there, we would think ideally that perhaps there would be more expenditure into influencing industry and less into influencing public opinion. The same is true for sort of direct care to animals. So this is things like running animal shelters. They're valuable for the animals that are in those shelters, but the cost of running those shelters compared to where that money could go elsewhere is enormous. So we think you could be having thousands of times more impact by that money going elsewhere in the movement. So we generally don't recommend charities that are involved with that kind of work. And the final point I want to make on this is capacity building. So capacity building makes up a very, very small amount of sort of overall expenditure in the movement. And when we think about if we've got if our goal is to end factory farming, and say that's going to happen in like 50 years, if we were to focus 5 years on intense capacity building and really like increasing the size of the movement and sort of doubling, if we doubled the amount of people that are working in a short amount of time, then over the course of sort of the 50 years or however it takes to end factory farming, we could massively reduce that time by focusing on capacity building more now. So the next point I want to make is about strategic thinking. So this is something a lot of our charities are really good at, and I think one of the best examples of this is perhaps the Open Wing Alliance that were formed by the Humane League, in terms of coming from their need to kind of address getting commitments from corporations that are operating globally, then and obviously only operating in the US at the time. Then by involving other groups from around the world in their corporate campaigns and kind of forming a overall strategy, then this has proved really successful. And things like the commitment from Nestle earlier this year that's kind of global would not have been doable without kind of this coordinated effort and this level of strategic thinking. In terms of on a kind of lower level, actually implementing strategy, then one of the best things to be doing is having like short, medium, and long-term goals. So if you formalize specific plans for like where you want to be in 10 years, 3 years, 1 year, and have the goals for each feeding into the next to kind of help steer you in a direction rather than kind of doing things as they come up. Similarly, as I've mentioned a few times, the theory of change. If you develop a theory of change for your own organization and then and also kind of understand the theory of change in the movement, perhaps in the country that you're operating in, then you can start to identify what's not being done and what kind of gaps are in the movement to kind of focus on. And understanding how your organization fits into the wider movement can be a great way of like increasing that impact. And then evaluation of your programs is something that there's a lot of, we just don't see many charities doing. So trying to kind of numerically assess the progress that your programs are making. So for example, if you have like a leafleting campaign, and you're running this leafleting campaign in cities, but also on like university campuses and different places, if you start to record where you're leafleting and how many leaflets you're distributing and how many volunteer hours that you're putting into each thing, and then over time, once you've got enough data, you can kind of start to see what's working and what isn't. And perhaps you're distributing way more leaflets at a university campus, so you might want to then shift your focus onto focusing more on university campuses because you're getting more done with the time and money that you're investing. But it's difficult to know that without tracking the data. It's the case that not the capacity to be able to do this is not always there within charities, and so sometimes like reaching out to data scientists and seeking sort of some data science consultation can be really valuable. And there are a lot of data scientists out there that are like pretty keen to work with charities as well, that we found. The other thing I want to make a point about is like this concept of counterfactual reasoning, which is quite a common thing we use in EA, and it's the idea that if you're focusing on, you've got one program and it's maybe not doing as well as your other programs, and you're not sure whether to spend more money on it or to keep going with it or what to do. If you think about where that money would be going if you weren't using that program at all, so if you were to close that program, then where would that money go? And so counterfactually, if that money would be having a better impact going towards another program, then it would be better to close that program, or it may not, depending on how that kind of evaluation works out. So the reason to do this is to increase your effectiveness over time. But the other thing is it makes communicating to donors really easy. If you've got solid numbers that you can bring and show that we've improved this program and we've done this and etc., then it can be a great way of kind of communicating the work that you're doing to your donors. And then the final thing that I want to talk about is culture. So this is something that we've found, particularly over the last couple of years, to be like increasingly important. And there are a ton of ways that you can look at culture within a charity and see how it can be improved. One thing that is great is transparency. So if you've got any information that you have internally that would be beneficial to other charities, if they could see that, and it doesn't affect any confidentiality or any campaigns that you're working on, then it's great to have that publicly available to other groups. And especially the same is true for like if you've made mistakes as an organization and things that you could have done differently, then sort of having an open discussion about that, or maybe like a page on your website, whatever it may be, is a great way of other groups being able to learn from that and not make the same mistakes. Then we have like harassment policies. So it's become pretty clear, at least in the US over the last year or two, that things like sexual harassment is there and not a free in the they still definitely happen within the animal advocacy movement. So having policies in place to kind of ensure and minimize these is essential, I would say, to create a safe environment for your employees. And then in terms of tracking culture, if you can survey your staff, so set up maybe every 6 months or so a survey that looks through, there are many examples online, but that assesses various aspects of your culture, and then you can enact change based on that. And if you have a system for anonymous feedback as well, so if a member of your organization has a problem and then they're not comfortable going to a senior staff member or their manager, then having a system where they can anonymously report that issue can be a great way to discover problems or address issues. And then there's an increasing body of evidence around sort of diversity and inclusivity. I think especially within the animal advocacy movement, there's like loads of women in the movement, but when you look at it's mostly women. I think it's like 70% women overall in the movement. But then when you look at like the senior levels of leadership, it's like mostly men. And obviously this is an imbalance that shouldn't be there. You wouldn't expect. So kind of thinking about how we can improve diversity and inclusivity is certainly something that there should be more focus on in the movement. And then finally, a great way to sort of address some of these culture issues is to have a culture committee in place. So this is something we've done at ACE recently, and it's worked really well. So you have like 4 or 5 lower staff if you're depending on the size of your organization, and then those staff are responsible for kind of coming up with proposals and researching things around culture that then they can pass on to leadership. And then have those changes enacted. So it's a great way to kind of have a group that are representing the interests of the rest of the staff. So that concludes my presentation. So any questions? You're welcome.
Thank you. Hi, this was very interesting. I have 2 questions. One first about the pie chart about, yes, that one. Influencing policy and the law. You kind of went quickly by that. I have a question about how you try to do that. Is that by lobbying or also by getting people in places? So making sure that ethical people become staffers or run for office or both.
So I think in terms of this proportion of the chart, this is talking about advocacy groups working on lobbying, ballot initiatives and things like that. And obviously that varies massively from location to location in terms of the legal systems and what can be done. One thing I did gloss over on quite early on was these 2 organizations. So 80,000 Hours are an organization that's set up to basically find what the best career paths are in terms of having an impact. And they do, one of their recommended career paths is going into positions within politics to influence change. So within the EO movement, that is a consideration.
And then, if you don't mind, I have a second question about maybe a little bit more of a meta question. Like, how do you measure your own effectiveness as ACE? Like, I know that because of you, I started supporting open cages. But do you have any evidence showing that because of your work, effective charities have become even more effective or have received more funding? Like, how do you track that?
Yeah, so we track as much of the funding that we can that are going to our top and standout charities. So any funding that's gone through our website to our top charities, we have a good indication. And then so we have 3 top charities and then about 10 or 11 standout charities that are sort of our second tier. For our top charities, we have really good numbers. Our total budget at ACE is just over $1 million, and we influence every year. It increases every year, but it's around $7 million. So for the money spent, each dollar spent on ACE, you're getting $7 that are directed to what we think are the most effective charities.
So what are the plans of ACE for the future?
That's a good question. So we're currently in the middle of our charity evaluations for this year. So at the end of November, we'll be publishing our updated reviews and recommendations. So we're just kind of in the process of finalizing those at the moment. We're currently going through a executive director transition. So our executive director, who's been with us since we started, sort of in our 5-year history, he's now moving on, and we're currently in a hiring process. So part of the direction of our future will be determined by the new executive director coming in. So it's kind of an uncertain time with what our direction will be, but I would imagine it will mostly continue as we have been with research and et cetera. Yeah.
First, thank you for the presentation. I'm going to try to ask this question as clearly as I can, because it's not even clear in my mind 100%. But when you're evaluating the effect, let's say the reduction of suffering on beings, let's say through an open cages campaign, are you also, and should we be, I don't know, evaluating the impact on the potentially the extension of, let's say, complete animal liberation? The reason I ask that is, having done work, let's say, with animal equality, with iAnimal, I know that one of the things that really impacts people and pushes them to go vegan and kind of promote anti-speciesism is the gruesomeness of the images, you know? If everything were kind of happy farms, I wonder if, I don't know, and do you consider that, maybe you've thought about this more, is that considered?
Yeah. So,
yeah.
So in terms of corporate campaigns, if they're improving welfare, the concern is that then those companies can then say, oh, we're humane now, and that sort of thing. Is that
so influencing public opinion becomes harder.
Okay.
So assuming it's true, I don't know if that's true, but assuming if you didn't improve welfare, it would take X amount of time for the world to go vegan, versus improving welfare extends that time. Do you include that extension of time, or should we ever consider that? I don't even know if that's true or not. I'm just curious if that's a part of it.
I think it comes down to kind of, there's just not enough evidence to know at the moment. And I think we do think about this, and we don't have a conclusive answer to it for sure. We think that probably say there was an extension of time, then the reduction of suffering now by having these corporate campaigns, I've not fully reasoned this out, but there's a balance there between whether that reduction in suffering is less than the extension. It's a really hard question to answer. But Yeah. But this is something we do think about.
I would like to ask how you evaluated charities for if you take into account local conditions. For example, in Poland, fur farms are, I think, much bigger than 1% of the animals that are suffering from the factory farming. But do you take it into account, or like you just based on the data from all over the world?
Yeah, we do. So when for example, when we evaluated open cages, we took into account the fur farming situation in Poland and the fact that there's a lot of fur farming centered around that region in Europe. So that is something that we did factor in. It's just the case that obviously, in the US it's different. So with those numbers, it's not representative necessarily.
Any other questions?
Hi. Going back to your slide about the different groups of animals, split into research. This one. So there's a group of wild animals that seems to be 1,000 times bigger than farmed animals, which in kind of the scale approach of effective altruism means it's 1,000 times more interesting than farmed animals. Is ACE doing any research in the area of reducing suffering in that area, and what the kind of tractability and neglectedness is there?
Yeah, so it is much larger as a group of animals. The issue comes with tractability. So this is something we do research. We have in the past recommended groups that are involved in wild animal suffering research and spreading kind of a global anti-speciesist messaging. The limiting factor is the tractability. So the basic idea behind wild animal suffering is that we think a lot of small animals in particular suffer in nature, and a lot of them, small animals, the way they tend to reproduce a huge amount of offspring, and then a very small proportion of that offspring survive to then reproduce, and a lot, 90% of them die at very early stages. So because they haven't lived long, and then they tend to meet grisly deaths of being eaten or whatever it may be. Then there's an argument that the vast majority of small animals are suffering, or they're living net negative lives, so they suffer more than they experience positive experiences. So then the argument from that is that potentially there's a huge amount of suffering going on in the wild, and if we can come up with ways to address that, then that would be something that's worthwhile at least looking into. The issue comes with tractability and implementing these things. So if you want to reduce the suffering of some insect that you think you come up with a system or an intervention to do that, because you're interfering with a really complex ecosystem, then that can have really adverse effects that you can't really account for. So at the moment, there's not enough research to know where to go with it or make progress. So a lot of the groups at the moment are focusing on actually building it up as an academic research field, so that there are then scientists will come through, researchers come through and work on it in the future. But it's something that we should be considering for sure.
Someone else? Any question? If not, then thank you very much for your presentation. And this was the last.